as the global pandemic continues to get worse, there is more calls on holding China accountable and investigating the WHO. Because remember, the WHO was pushing the Chinese propaganda, saying, hey, this isn't a threat, there's no need to take action. So it delayed the global response to the coronavirus outbreak. Now, funding these international institutions in which we, the United States, are their biggest funders, and then these international institutions go off and attack the United States by pushing the propaganda, the narratives, and the storylines of these oppressive, human rights abusing regimes. If they're going to do that, why should we continue to fund them? And if they're going to go through and help push Chinese propaganda in order to delay the world's response to a global pandemic, why shouldn't we go off and investigate them and consider defunding them? And based off of everything that's happened, why wouldn't we be looking into ways to hold China accountable for their actions? And so there is a growing call, and Fox News came out with this.
Reportedly, the Trump administration is weighing legal actions and options over allegations that China hoarded critical medical supplies to intentionally corner the market on this stuff. A senior legal advisor to the president telling the New York Post, people are dying when you have intentional, cold-blooded, premeditated action like you have with China. This would be considered first-degree murder. Here to weigh in, Fox News contributor and former South Carolina Congressman Trey Gowdy. Congressman, good morning to you. Apparently, according to this New York Post story, during the month of January, executives from 3M and Honeywell were told they could not export any of their masks and PPE out of China. And at the same time, China was gathering things from Asia and South America and the EU as well. Nobody knew what was going on in China. Had they known, they probably wouldn't have sent the stuff because everybody else needed it.
You got a couple of options, Steve. There are international entities, whether it's the United Nations, the World Health Organization, there's the International Court of Justice. There are actually treaties that govern the interactions between countries as it relates to infectious disease, but those are toothless. You've got American courts, but you got to get around the Foreign Sovereign Immunity Act. And then if you get around that, you got proof problems. I mean, how's an individual American supposed to get information from China when the rest of the world cannot? The Trump administration doesn't need to go to court to hold China accountable. You can hit them where it hurts the most. You can ostracize them on the world stage, quit letting their students come here and study. You can make them a pariah, but most importantly, you can start deducting the amount of money we owe them and other countries owe them, deduct our costs, including the loss of life. But all the other costs, start deducting that and then see what China's reaction is.
Okay, so there's a couple of things in there to unpack. First off, China, knowing that this was an actual threat that could affect the rest of the world, was downplaying this in coordination with the WHO. And while they were downplaying this, they were having the rest of the global community send them personal protective equipment, medical equipment, and they were starting to hoard it. Now, what do we see? China has most of the world's stockpile and emergency supplies of personal protective equipment, to which now they get to determine which countries to give it back to, right? And what countries they're going to give it back to depends on which countries are going to help support and push the communist Chinese narrative. That no, China did a great job. No, this isn't China's fault. And hey, this may have actually been manufactured in the United States. Those are the people who are willing to push that would go through and get the medical equipment while they hold the rest of us hostage, while we try to go up and up our manufacturing capabilities of these equipment. But there's another thing to unpack there, and that is, how do we hold China financially responsible for the global pandemic? And this is actually a tough question. And Trey Gowdy tries to go off and make it seem like this is simple, that we start deducting what we owe to China, from the national debt, and therefore we can hold them financially accountable there. Now, there have been other theories that have been floated out, such as, hey, China has assets here in the United States and treasury assets, and we can just go off and confiscate those. But there is a slight problem with that because we can't go off and do that unilaterally. We would need to go off with our allies and the international community before we can even think about taking that route. Why? Because if we start going off and just confiscating China's assets here in the United States, especially their treasury assets, or we start going off and deducting what we owe to China for the damage caused by the coronavirus, China would be able to go out there and call this defaulting on the debt, that we are refusing to honor our debt obligations, and that we're not acknowledging our debt obligations, and say that, we are bad debtors. And that could have a huge financial impact, as there are plenty on the world stage, such as Russia, such as, Iran, and many other countries that do not like the United States that would be more than willing to go out there and push that particular narrative, that holding China financially accountable by, if they refuse to actually pay, by reducing it from our debt or confiscation of their assets. There's plenty on the world community that would love to hit the United States and claim that we are bad debtors or defaulting on our debt. And the financial consequences, if that were allowed to actually spread and become the global narrative, would be devastating to the United States. So there are ways in which we can hold China accountable. But unfortunately, because of globalism, the globalism that the left loves so much, that doing so is not as easy as just saying, hey, we'll just deduct it from our debt. There needs to be more planning. And this is where Trump needs to go out and be talking with our allies, with the international community. Now, yes, I'm sure we'll have also plenty of allies out there pushing back against the Chinese narrative. But if we are the only ones doing it, that becomes hard. But if we can go out there and say, hey, UK, to those in the UK and the EU, hey, this is one way we can hold China financially accountable for the devastation to our economy that this global pandemic has caused. And the UK and the EU agree to that, and they also deduct the expense of the coronavirus from their debt obligations to China. Well, then it makes it harder for China to be able to push their propaganda narrative about us being bad debtors. And going outside of the EU and the UK, we have to try and go around to all of our allies and do this as one global action. Because just doing this unilaterally will come back to bite us in the butt. So I do like the idea, and I do think that China should be held accountable. It's how we do that we need to be more thoughtful of and more deliberate with our international allies. Now, there are other things that we can do that may not require our international allies, such as, us deciding as a nation to boycott, products and services that have a made in China stamp on it. So we can stop buying products from China. Just do a boycott. We don't have to go through and do sanctions on China. We don't have to worry about doing that in any way. We can just, as American consumers, be more deliberate about our purchases and decide that, hey, if your products are being made in China, we're not going to buy from you. If your product has made in China on it, we're not going to buy from you. We're not going to let China profit from a global pandemic that they are responsible for. And they are responsible for the loss of lives that resulted from it. So we need to start coming up with all the free time that we have, all the ways in which we can start holding China accountable, both with our international allies and here within the United States. And without our international allies, just doing a boycott would be our only option. But we know what would happen. We know the moment we start trying to boycott goods made in China, Chinese products. We know how that's going to go. The left will come out and declare this racism, right? They'll come out and say, hey, if you're not buying Chinese products, you're a racist. Hey, if you're boycotting, Chinese-owned businesses, you're a racist. Now, we do need to be careful on the boycott, though, of Chinese products and services, because boycotting Chinese products doesn't mean boycotting Chinese American businesses, right? So if that happened to be the effect, we would give the leftist narrative some credence. But going through and visiting a Chinese American restaurant or Chinese American business, that should remain and continue. But buying products manufactured in the Chinese country, in China, that is not racism, right? So we need to make sure that we are deliberate in doing the research before we start, implementing boycotts on various things. And by the way, it's not even about Chinese businesses, here in the United States. If any other company, regardless of the racial demographics, are going off and they are locating their manufacturing for their products in China and then bringing them into the United States for sale, we should boycott those businesses' products. If they're using, software or technology that is created in China, then we should not use that. We should boycott that. So we need to make sure that we do our research before we call for a boycott of a particular business. But without our international allies boycotting and ceasing to buy Chinese products will be about the only way that we can hold China financially accountable and hit them where it hurts. Now, hopefully, Trump can use his influence as a world leader, and go out there and convince our allies. And hey, hopefully this should be easier than anybody expects. I mean, think about this. All of our allies are suffering economically from this pandemic. And if they can reduce the economic impact by agreeing to reduce the cost of the coronavirus from their debts to China, hey, that might actually serve their best interest and help them out economically so their economies don't collapse. So maybe getting the world stage to agree to this may be easier than what I'm predicting. But with the left and their idea of being able to go out there and just label the action racism, something that should be intuitive, something that should be simple, something that should be common sense, may prove to be nearly impossible to accomplish.